The goal of statistics is to take data and make some kind of conclusion or assumption from it. But before we can get into actually taking data and doing the mathematics behind it, we have to look at the correct and ethical ways to collect that data. So that's what chapter 4 is about, designing studies. So in this chapter, we're going to look at if we wanted to do an experiment or an observational study, what would we have to do? What would be the appropriate steps that we would need to take in order to make sure that our data wasn't corrupted, that there wasn't anything wrong with it, that it wasn't biased, and that we were being ethical and that we weren't doing anything that goes against human rights or animal rights or any of that kind of stuff. There's a lot of vocabulary in this chapter, so we're going to start out with some of the most basic and important ones that you need to know. First one is population. So the population is the group of individuals that we want to know the information about. So if I want to know the heights of all students at K Park High School, then all of the students at K Park High School are my population. Okay. Sometimes you can use what's called a census to collect that data. So if it's possible, which in the case of all the heights of the K Park students, you could take a census. So that would mean you would go through and you would get the height of every single student at K Park High School, and you would use that to determine the average height of all of the students. So it collects data from every single individual in the population. Now, a sample is a subset of individuals in the population. So a census isn't always the easiest way to go. Census usually costs a lot of money, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of people in order to do it. If you want to do a census of the entire United States, which they try to do every 10 years, it's really difficult to do. It's difficult to get every single person to answer a question or be able to contact every single person in the US. So usually census are not used. Usually they use a sample. So they will take a collection of people, a little subgroup of people, and ask them and then use their data in order to make an assumption about what they think the actual value is. So a little diagram here. We have our population as the blue box. That's everyone we want to know about. And then inside that blue box, we take that small oval, that sample, out in order to look at their data. So we collect data from the representative sample, and then we make an inference about the population. Okay, so we use the sample to make an inference. An inference is like an estimate or a guess. And the way that you get your sample helps you have a good or a bad inference. If you don't collect your sample in a good way, then your data might be skewed, which we're going to talk about that later on in the chapter. Okay, now we're going to look at how you would go about actually choosing a sample from a population. If your population is really varied and has a lot of different components to it, choosing a sample might not be that easy. So first of all, you need to define your population. So you need to know what your population is. If I want to know the heights of all students at K Park, then all students at K Park are my population. But if I only want to know the heights of male students at K Park, then only the male students are my population. So I'm not going to pick a sample from all of the students at K Park and get females in that sample if I only care about the males. So defining your population is important. Then you need to know what it is you want to measure. If I want to measure the heights of students at K Park, then I need to be measuring their height, not their weight, not their GPA, not anything else. I also need to make sure that I'm measuring it in the correct unit. So if I want to measure their height in inches, I'm not going to measure them in centimeters, or I'm going to make sure that I convert that after the fact. And then step 3, you want to decide how to choose the sample from the population. There are good ways to choose samples and there are bad ways to choose samples. So now we're going to look at how to sample badly. So how can we choose a sample that we can trust to represent the population? So there are many different ways to choose a sample. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. We're going to look at some of the bad ones. First of all, convenient sampling. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's convenience. You choose the individuals because they're easy to get. So if you, a lot of times if you've ever been to the mall or out in public and you have people who are trying to do a survey and they just grab the first person that they see, that's the convenient sampling. They haven't really done anything to choose their people. They're just choosing them randomly based on who walks by. Okay, so with convenient sampling, the problem with that is you could potentially get um, a lot of people that share something in common that your entire population doesn't share. Okay, and then we have a voluntary response sample. This is where people choose to respond to a general invitation. So this is like magazines or websites or the news now. They do these polls where they send out these requests for people to contact back or to fill out a survey online about how they feel about a topic or an issue. These are voluntary response samples because these people are voluntarily responding to this. This isn't good because a lot of times it's only people who have strong opinions. So, for example, if you go onto Yelp or any of the other sites that rate like restaurants or hotels, it's usually people who either had a really good experience or a really bad experience. The average person doesn't go on there and fill out surveys usually. So when you look at that kind of data, you have to keep that in mind that, oh, this was a voluntary response. So these people are probably pretty passionate about what they're answering. Okay, the next word that you need to know is bias. Bias is important. We'll be talking about this for the whole rest of the year. So the design of a statistical study can show bias if it consistently underestimates or overestimates the value you want to know. So bias happens when you choose one of those types of sampling methods because, like I said, it's only people with strong opinions. So if you're asking someone how they liked the food at a restaurant and you're doing a voluntary response, then the people who are going to respond are probably going to be the ones either who really super loved the restaurant or really hated the restaurant. The rest of the people aren't really going to say much most of the time. So you're going to get either a really strong opinion about how good it was or a really strong opinion about how bad it was. So it's going to either overestimate or underestimate the value that you're trying to find out. For example, one on your notes sheet, just fill in why convenient and voluntary response samples are considered biased. We just talked about that. So convenient samples, they're convenient. So you're picking people that might all share the same opinion. They're more likely to share the same opinion because you're getting them all from the same area instead of randomly selecting them. And then the voluntary response, we just talked about that. It's only people with strong opinions. So just fill that out on your worksheet. Okay, now we're going to look at how to sample well. So what are some good sampling methods? The main one, the simplest one, why it's called simple random sampling, is because it's pretty much the easiest one. This is a sample chosen by chance. So, and that helps to rule out favoritism by the sampler and self-selection by the respondents. So it stops the person who's selecting from picking people that they want, and it stops the responders from just volunteering because they have strong opinions. So random sampling involves using a chance process to determine which members of a population are included in the sample. Simple random sample is the simplest one of these. So a simple random sample is chosen in such a way that every group of individuals in the population has an equal chance of being selected. So if I want to get a sample of all the students at K Park because I want to measure their heights. A simple random sample would mean that I number all of the students at K Park from 1 to, I think now we probably have about 1,850 students. So from 1 to 1,850, everyone gets a number. And then I either use a random number generator or I use a computer or I put their numbers in a hat and I draw them out. I use some sort of random method for selecting the numbers. And then the numbers I choose are the people that I look at. So if I choose, 5, 400, 35, 27, and so on, those are the only kids that I'm going to measure. And then I will use their measurements to average to determine what a good estimate of the height would be. Now, the reason this is a simple random sample is because every group has an equal chance of being selected. So if I'm picking 100 students, it is possible that I could have 25 freshmen, 25 sophomore, 25 junior, 25 senior. It's also quite possible that I could have 50 freshmen and 50 sophomores and no juniors and seniors. And it's possible that all 100 could be all seniors. It's possible that all 100 could be boys, or all 100 could be girls, or 50-50 could be boys and girls. There's a possibility that I could get every type of combination. So it does not mean that I'm going to have an equal representation of each type of student. So keep that in mind. Okay. In practice, just a little note at the bottom, people use random number generators by a computer calculator. We'll be looking at that later on. If you don't have technology, you can always use a random digit table. There's one of those in your book. You won't use those as often, but we will talk about how to read those as well. Okay, so how to choose an SRS, a simple random sample. This is already printed on your notes, so I'm just going to go through it pretty quickly here. If you have technology, like I said, you're going to label each individual with a number, so 1 through whatever. So students at K Park, 1 through 1850, or however many you have. Then we're going to randomize. You're going to use a random number generator to obtain however many you need. So if you need 100 people, you're going to do it 100 times and get 100 different numbers from 1 to n. If you're picking people or items, animals, you can't repeat. So that means if you've picked number 27 and you get number 27 again, your calculator will repeat sometimes. So you have to just skip over that. So that's something you have to keep in mind. We don't want to repeat the person or the object or the animal. If you are using a table, you're still going to label each one with a number, but they all have to have the same number of digits. So for example, if I have 200 people in my population, so 200 people total, and I need to pick 50 of them, then I'm going to label each person with 3 digits because I have 200 and every person has to have the same number of digits. So person number 1 is going to be 001. Person number 2 is going to be 002. Okay, person number 54 is going to be 054. So we number them based on the number of digits that is the largest number in our sample. And then again, we're going to randomize. We're going to read consecutive groups of digits of the appropriate length from left to right on the table. And in tests and on the AP exam and on quizzes, we're going to provide you with that table. So there's a table in your textbook that your textbook is going to use for homework questions, but you're going to be using the table that I provide you on tests or that the AP exam provides you. So they will have it there for you and it'll be labeled. So if they say, I want you to look at line 54 is going to be labeled for you and you read left to right. If you hit the end of a line, so if you go through line 54, you just go back to the beginning of the next line and do it all over again. Okay, so you just continue to read the numbers, and we're gonna do an example in just a second. And then you just stop when you've hit that number of different labels. So again, we don't want to repeat. If we have 54 and we choose 54 again, then we're going to skip it and go to the next one. So your sample is going to contain the individuals that you found for both the technology and the table. So if you found numbers 25, 37, 54, 23, and so on, those are your people that are people, objects, or animals that you're going to choose in your sample. Okay, so now we're going to look at an example of how to use a table to find your simple random sample. So it says use table D at line 130 to choose an SRS of 4 hotels. They went ahead and printed out a table D for you so that you wouldn't have to worry about it. That's this right here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do that. They have already also numbered the hotels for you. So they have all the hotels. There was 28 hotels total. Since 28 is our biggest number and it has 2 digits, every hotel has 2 digits. So the first one has 01, 02, 03, and so on until we get to 28. So they're all numbered. Since each one has 2 digits, we have to look at each 2 digits as we go. So you're going to break your line up into 2 digits for each item that you're looking at. So like we draw, when you have a space, like 1 and 6 have a space, that's okay. They're still the same. It separates it by 5s to make it easier to read. But 1 and 6 make 16. Okay, so we're just going to keep separating. So we separate by 2s, and I'm not going to do the entire line, but you kind of get the point. So we separate it by 2s. Then we look at those numbers. So our numbers that we get, you click forward here, we have 69, we have 5, we have 16, 48, and so on. And they went ahead and did the entire row for you. We need 4 hotels from this list. This list only goes to 28. So 69 is not going to work because it's too large, but 5 works, 16 will work, 48 is too large, 17 will work, 87 is too large. We got 17 again. We don't want to repeat because we already chose 17, so we get rid of it. 40 is too large, 95 is too large. Again, we repeated 17, we don't want that. 84 is too large, 53, 40, 64, 89, 87, and thank goodness we actually get to the final one, 20 works, okay? So our 4 hotels we're gonna pick, 5, 16, 17, and 20. Those are the ones we choose. And so they go through and do exactly the same process. Okay, so the basic idea of sampling is pretty straightforward. We take an SRS from the population and we use our sample to get information about the population. Now, sometimes there are advantages to using a more complex sampling method. We just talked about that. It's fully possible that I could get, if I wanted the heights of everyone at K Park and I did an SRS, I could just get all 100 seniors. Well, seniors usually are taller than freshmen and sophomores. So if I'm measuring all 100 seniors, I'm probably gonna have a little bit of an overestimate for my height. So the way that we combat this is we can do what's called stratification. So it's a stratified random sample. What this does is it separates the population by classifying it into groups of similar individuals called strata. Then we choose an SRS from each stratum. So my K Park Heights example, I have freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Let's say that I want to guarantee that I get 25% from each of those groups because I want to make sure that it's spread amongst the ages. So I am going to go through, if I want 100 people in my sample, then I'm going to pick 25 freshmen, 25 sophomore, 25 junior, and 25 seniors. I'm going to separate them based on their classification. Then I just go in and pick 25 from this group, 25 from that group, and so on. So each stratum is going to be numbered from 1 to whatever. So if there's 500 of each, let's just say, 500 sophomore, freshman, junior, and senior, then I number each one from 1 to 500 and randomly select 25 from each group. I would randomly select them from each group individually. So the 25, the numbers that I get for freshmen are not the same numbers necessarily that I'll use for sophomores. So I redo my sampling method each time. Then I take all of these people, put them together, and that becomes my 100 sample that I need. So you can also, it doesn't have to just be, you can classify them by anything. So we classified them by kind of age, by their class, right? So where they were located. We can also classify them by, because heights sometimes can differ between boys and girls, we could also, instead of doing that, we could say that we want 50 boys and 50 girls. So we could classify them there as well. You could also, I guess, technically classify each grade level by boys and girls. So you could do each grade level and then take each one of those and separate them by boys and girls and number each and make sure you get an even number from each category. So stratification helps a lot guarantee that you get an equal distribution of your people. Another type is called cluster. So stratification, the one that we just talked about, deals with characteristics, male and female, grade level, AP or level classes, anything about them, blonde haired and brunettes, blue eyes and brown eyes. Like those are classifications for stratification, where you separate people or items into groups. Cluster sample deals with where they're located. So for example, if I am a political analyst and I'm looking to survey people about politics, I'm probably not going to separate my people into strata because I'm not going to look at them and say, well, you guys are all brown-eyed and you guys are all blue-eyed, and I'm going to ask you which candidate you like, because that's probably not going to affect which candidate they're going to go for. But their location, where they live, probably will. So that's what a cluster sample is. A cluster sample means that you go and you look at locations and you choose locations. So to get a cluster sample, you're going to classify the population into groups of individuals that are located near each other, and then choose an SRS of the actual clusters themselves. So this time you're not choosing an SRS of the individual people. So for example here, if I wanted to know about heights of high school students in Humble ISD, then I would separate the Humble ISD into the different high schools, which are my locations. So Atascocita would be one, Kingwood High, K Park, Summerwood, Humble, all of the high schools. And then I would randomly select which high schools I wanted to use. So that's a cluster. Then I survey every single person in that high school. Okay, so that's the difference. Stratification, separate them, randomly select the people. Cluster, you separate them by location and then randomly select the location, and everybody at that location gets surveyed. Okay, so at the beginning of the PowerPoint, we talked about using these samples to form an inference, and we said that inference was kind of like an estimate, a conclusion, an assumption based on our sample. So that's another word that you need to know, so make sure you write this one down. The process of drawing conclusions about a population on the basis of sample data is called an inference. So why do we rely on random sampling? I already have this on your notes, so I'm going to go through it really quickly. Number one, to avoid bias. We talked about that. So if I am picking the people that I survey, then they might be biased. I might only be picking people that appeal to me, people who look easy to survey. Also, if they're choosing to answer the question themselves by voluntary response, then that means that they probably have a strong opinion. So they're going to be biased one way or another. So we do this to avoid that. So we get a good list of everyone in our population. Number two, the laws of probability allow for trustworthy inference if you do this. So if you random sample, then probability helps us, control our margin of error. So results from random samples come with a margin of error that sets bounds on the size of the likely error, which we'll get way more into margin of error when we start talking about confidence intervals later on in the year and next semester. But it helps a lot because it keeps our error, like we know that we're only going to be wrong by this much, and that's what we want, because if we just let people choose themselves or we choose them ourselves, then we have a much larger error that it could be. And then larger random samples give better information about the population, so it makes sense. If I want to know the heights of all students at K Park and I only pick 2 students to measure, it's probably not going to be as accurate as if I go out and I pick 500 students to measure. So the bigger the sample, the better your data is going to be. Okay, so let's talk about what can go wrong. These are different types of bias that can happen when you don't survey correctly. So undercoverage. Undercoverage happens when some members of the population cannot be chosen. So for example, if a surveyor is calling people who only have landlines, my husband and I would not be ever chosen in that survey because we do not have a landline. We use cell phones only. So I would be undercovered. So undercoverage just means that not everyone in your population can be chosen because of the way you chose to do your sample. Non-response means that you've contacted people, but they chose not to respond. So they either didn't answer the phone, or they just said, no, thank you, I'm not interested in answering your survey, and they moved on. So this is non-response. They chose not to respond. You chose them, but they said no. And then you have response bias. This is when they're not answering truthfully or correctly. So this can happen sometimes with the way that you ask. If you're in a big group of people who have one opinion and you're asking someone who might have a different opinion, they're less likely to state their different opinion out loud. So they could lead to response bias. They could lie about how they feel about something or their opinion on a topic because they feel pressured to answer a certain way. That's response bias. So it's like they're lying, and it's not necessarily malicious, but it could just be caused by peer pressure or things around them. And then wording of the question. This one is where the way you word something can cause someone to answer differently. So if I ask, do you agree with abortion? And then I just stop my survey there. That's one way to word it. I might get different responses if I were to word it a different way, such as, do you agree with murdering unborn children? Those are the same, I mean, to some people, those are the same question. They have the same premise, but they have totally different meanings to other people. So they can be answered incorrectly, or someone could be swayed to answer more in one way than another. So wording of the question is very important. It can cause a lot of issues with your survey. So that's it for section 4.1. On the bottom of your notes, I did add some extra stuff, so make sure that you look on there. These are important distinctions. I put these on here because these are things that students usually confuse or misunderstand every year, so pay close attention to those. I gave you types of sampling methods and the types of bias. They are not the same, okay? Sampling methods are ways to get a sample, and then next to them I put whether they're good or bad. So like convenience and voluntary response, those are bad. We don't want to do those. Simple random sample, stratified and clustered, those are good. We like to do those depending on your situation. And then the types of bias, they are all bad. Bias is a bad thing. Those are those four. You need to know those. So your test is going to distinguish between bias and sampling methods. Voluntary response is not a bias. It is a sampling method. It's a way that you collected your data. Now there can be biases that come from it, but it itself is not a bias. So make sure you know the difference between those. So I added those at the bottom of your notes as well.